أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. I want to begin by playing a recording. I want you to listen carefully to this. Let's see if I have my volume on. One second. Technology. This is a recording of one of my favorite reciters, Muhammad Siddiq al-Mishawi, and his rendition of Nahawand. It's one of the maqamat, one of the tunes or scales that's used for recitation of the Qur'an. His particular kind of brand and kind of Nahawand, it always brings chills to me and has the potential to bring me to tears. But I wanted to impress on you first, before I get into kind of the more intellectual part of the discussion, impress on you the importance of learning tajweed, like Sister Nicole just emphasized as well. The aesthetics of the Qur'an, while it's not the primary purpose of the Qur'an, it is an extremely important part of it. Right? The ability of this book to speak to us not only on the level of ideas, but also on the aesthetic plane. The emotion that the recitation can evoke, the way the words and the way the rhythm of the Qur'an flows, that also has an incredible effect, right? It impresses a person who listens to it. It evokes certain emotions. The same thing that music does to us, right? Different kinds of music evoke different kinds of responses within us. The music of the Qur'an is also similar, and that can only be accomplished by correct and beautiful recitation. Like clumsy recitation with bad pronunciation and stretches of the wrong places and chopping off of syllables and sounds and mispronunciation of words, it sounds so ugly and kind of clumsy that it kind of hampers and hinders any sort of other further reflection on the text itself. So it's really important, and it's something that we should put emphasis on. The fact that we don't, this is kind of a hallmark of the Shia, unfortunately, nowadays, is that we recite very badly. Right? When oftentimes I've had several people, after they listen to me or they pray behind me, they'll come up and say, "Are you really Shia? Are you a Sunni?" Right? That's their impression. If you recite Qur'an with tajweed, you must not be a Shi'i scholar. You must be a Sunni scholar. That should not be one of the shi'ar of Shia, one of the hallmarks of the Shia. Right? We should be, as the Ahlul Bayt want us to be, the foremost of those who are interested and are connected with the Qur'an. A couple of ahadith. One from the Prophet ﷺ in Al-Kafi, he's quoted as saying, لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ حِلْيَةٌ وَحِلْيَةُ الْقُرْآنِ الصَّوْتُ الْحَسَنِ. Right? Everything has a decoration that adorns it and has the potential to beautify it. The Qur'an is adorned by our beautiful voice. Right? So foster your beautiful voice. If you don't have a voice, you can recite it also in a moving way, in a monotone. Right? But the pronunciation has to be there, the precision, the rhythm, those things can be there even if you don't have the skills of a voice or you're tone deaf. You can still recite the Qur'an in a beautiful way. All right. More than let's leave the aesthetics aside. That's one important part of the Qur'an. One of the challenges that we face when we're trying to approach the Qur'an, especially those of you who don't know Arabic and can't access the Qur'an directly, either directly to the text, or you can't even access the commentaries that we have many of, but primarily in Arabic and then in some other foreign languages. One of the challenges that we face is the Qur'an is arranged in a way that is very challenging. It's very difficult to even comprehend why it's ordered and sequenced in this particular way. Right? You come to the Qur'an, and let's leave aside the order of the surahs. The order of the surahs is not really important, and there's difference of opinion about how these came into this order, and it's pretty much arbitrary. From longest to shortest, generally, is the way it's been ordered. That's not really important in terms of the meaning of the Qur'an anyway. But within the particular surahs, Right? You've experienced this where you open up a couple of pages of the Qur'an and read, and on a given page you'll have discussions of the attributes of God, you'll have the judgment day, you'll have laws of marriage, you'll have ethical principles, you'll have history of the prophets, and all sorts of things, one after the other. And it's hard to see any rhyme and reason, any order in which these verses have been placed there. And it's challenging for us to come to terms with that, because this is a book that's kind of vaunting itself as the miracle of the Prophet, something that's inimitable, a book itself that's supposed to be the key to us having certainty that our Prophet is truly a prophet from God. That's challenging us to come up with something like it. But then when we read it, we're kind of left puzzled, and we're thinking, that's kind of a weird way to write. Why is it in this kind of order? Why isn't it speaking in a systematic way? Why doesn't it start with one concept and kind of carry through the thought and give me something substantial before it moves on to something else, the way we're used to in other kinds of literature? There is a passage from Sayyid al-Khui's Al-Bayan I want to read to you. The translation of that is the Prolegomena to the Qur'an, translated by Aziz Sachedina. So he has, Sayyid al-Khui offers this explanation to try to make sense of the reason why the Qur'an is written the way it is. He says the Qur'an was revealed for the guidance of mankind and to lead them toward their happiness in this world and in the next. It is not a book of history or jurisprudence or ethics or anything else that requires that it devote a separate section to each of these subjects. There is indeed no doubt that the Qur'an is the best suited mode to achieve the desired goal. This is because the reader of some surahs of the Qur'an would be able to cover many of its purposes and objectives in the shortest time possible and with the least trouble. He can thus turn his attention to the creation, to creation and the final return for judgment, and be informed about the bygone nations and take warning from them. Moreover, he can benefit from the excellent virtues and the lofty branches of knowledge and learn aspects of injunctions concerning the forms of worship and the rules of transaction. All this is achieved while preserving the sequence of the discourse and doing justice to its clarity and observing the requirements of the situation. These benefits could not be derived from the Qur'an if it had been divided into topical sections and chapters, because the reader would not have been able to encompass the goals of the Qur'an except by reading it in its entirety. All right, so he's saying that if the Qur'an, imagine if the Qur'an had been written kind of the way we'd like it to be written. Chapter 1 is on God, His existence and His attributes. Chapter 2 is on, the guidance that God has sent through the prophets. And he goes through all, like start with Adam and go all the way to the last of the prophets. Chapter 3, on and on. And he goes through various beliefs, and then once you're done with your beliefs, then you go into practices. Chapter 20 on Tahara, chapter 21 on prayer, and so on and so forth. If you read that book beginning to end the way we're encouraged to constantly be reading the Qur'an, for weeks on end you'd be reading and reading, and you'd only get a handful of the topics that you're supposed to be touching on. Right? So even with a regular sort of a reading regimen, you would not be constantly exposed to those things that are most important. But the way the Qur'an is arranged, if you can challenge yourself to this as well. Look every couple of pages. The normal kind of reading passages that you might, like the amount of reading that you might do on a daily basis. Take 2, 3 pages, 5 pages, whatever you usually read on a daily basis, which inshallah you should be. And if you're not, try to make that a regular thing that you do. Within that couple of pages that you read, you'll find basically all of those things that are most important for us to know. Some mention of all of these different topics that he also mentioned in terms of our beliefs, practices, ethical principles, history. We never have a kind of a complete story beginning to end, with the exception of Surah Yusuf. Right, but other than that, you have kind of a sprinkling here and there just to mention, because of some other sort of a point that's being made, that remember this little incident that happened to Moses, and how this is also related to some other greater kind of message that's being communicated. So you're constantly reminded on a daily basis of all of those major principles, instead of having topic and then leaving that topic aside, and then maybe on chapter 10 and 11 and 12 for 2-3 weeks at a time, you maybe have no discussion on God and His attributes at all. Right? That wouldn't serve the purpose of a daily kind of liturgy that we're reciting on a daily basis. So the Qur'an, this is what one, when I read this, I remember many years ago from Sayyid al-Khuy, for the first time I felt a sense of satisfaction that there is some rhyme and reason to the seeming chaos of the Qur'an. That it's not kind of a fluke, it's not something that's been kind of pieced together as our Sunni kind of counterparts. They have this idea that the compilation of the Qur'an happened after the Prophet's death, right? Through a process of basic kind of piecing together bits and pieces from here and there. Right? There are many ahadith. Sayyid al-Khuy also discusses this at length in Al-Bayan. And one of the accounts tells us that in the time of Abu Bakr's Khilafah, Umar had this impetus to put the Qur'an together, and they employed Zayd ibn Thabit to do this, who was not very qualified himself. He was a very young companion. He had been a scribe, but he was like a teenager during the time of the Prophet. Certainly not like Ubay ibn Ka'ab and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and the senior companions who had been known for being reciters of the Qur'an. But because he was kind of a nobody, he was safe. So they gave him power because he wasn't going to challenge their power, whereas those other people, they knew who they were and how badly qualified they were and how very qualified they themselves were, and that would be a challenge to them. So anyway, this process happens, and they end up having this, you have two verses, you come forth and you say, I have these two verses, and somebody else comes and testifies. Two people corroborate, they'll say, okay, we'll include this in the Qur'an. Another two people come with some verses, they'll include that in the Qur'an as well. And so they end up kind of piecing together what people can remember from the time of the Prophet, and they come up with this Qur'an, and that's what we have now. And there's so many reasons why that's absurd, logically and kind of theologically, as well as historically. And anyway, there's a long discussion that Sayyid al-Khuy has as well to rebut those ideas and establish that no, in fact, the Qur'an was compiled by the Prophet himself. The order that we now have is not a random fluke of history that things were pieced together, but rather this is the order in which the Prophet himself intended the Qur'an to be. For the most part, it was the order of revelation. And in some cases, it was not the order of revelation, but it was still intentionally arranged in this particular way by the Prophet, and that the surahs, as we have them now, were there at the time of the Prophet himself. And so we have to come to terms with the order that they're in. We can't justify it and say, well, actually, there's supposed to be some other order. No, this is the order, and there is some wisdom behind the seeming randomness of the Qur'an. So this is one of the challenges that we face, that the order of the Qur'an is in this challenging way. I think there's another explanation for the nature of the Qur'an as well. Sometimes the order of the Qur'an is kind of maddening, the way I've just described. Sometimes the elliptical nature of the Qur'an and the kind of mysterious nature of the Qur'an is also maddening for us. There are verses, we know that they're mutashabihat. The Qur'an itself tells us that they're muhkamat in the Qur'an, and they're mutashabihat. Some verses that are clear, unambiguous, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. There's no way to interpret that as a trinity or anything but the unity of God. But there are mutashabihat as well that are ambiguous at some level, that can be interpreted in different ways, that could go this way, could go that way because of the words that are used, the way the verse flows. So there's this ambiguity, and that's also maddening to us sometimes. Well, why would Allah not make everything clear? Why does He make some things ambiguous? I think one of the explanations that we, especially as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, understand is that the Qur'an sometimes explicitly tells us to go to the Prophet, and sometimes implicitly it does that. The system of guidance that Allah gave us was not meant to just be the Qur'an, where we could say Hasbuna Kitabullah, and that the Qur'an would be sufficient, and the Prophet is basically just a conduit for the Qur'an to come to us. Once we have the Qur'an, we no longer need the Prophet. Right? But rather we're supposed to have the Thaqalain together, right? In tandem, they are perfect guidance. Both, each one individually is insufficient. So one of the things that the Qur'an does is it explicitly says, مَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ مَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُ. Whatever the Prophet gives you, take. Whatever he tells you not to do and prohibits you from, then you leave that off. أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. It explicitly tells us to obey him, to listen to him, to take from him. But then implicitly, through these points of ambiguity, verses that tell you something and then kind of leave you hanging. Implicitly, it's telling you that it's something important, right? Here's an admonishment, an exhortation, a law even, but there's a little bit of ambiguity left in it, and then we're left kind of with a question mark, and we have to go and find the answer, and the only one who can explain that to us is the Prophet himself or the Ahlul Bayt. And so we're forced then to never be able to feel like we're satisfied with the Qur'an by itself, but rather we always have to link back from the Qur'an, go back to the source of the knowledge through the Ahlul Bayt, and then with the two together, we're able to complete that kind of cycle of knowledge and come up with something solid, not ambiguous anymore. So I think these are two ways to understand and justify and rationalize why the Qur'an is the way it is. So that when we read it, we have this in mind. We're not coming to it with an expectation that there should be like a textbook, but rather we take it as it is and try to find the wisdom behind it, because we understand where it's come from and we understand some of the wisdom behind the way that it has been put together for us. Another challenge that we face, besides the nature of the Qur'an, is especially as people who are approaching the Qur'an with translation. There's so many difficulties with translation, as I'm sure, inshallah, you are aware of through your own encounter with different translations. And the problems of translation are many. And it's not just a matter of the translation, in fact, it's even a problem with the Arabic itself. Like many of you are from Arabic backgrounds, but you should realize, if you haven't realized this already, one of my tasks when I teach Arabs Arabic is first to break them of this notion that Lebanese or Iraqi or other different dialects are in fact Arabic, because they're not. Right? They're not Arabic. They're as much Arabic as Urdu and Farsi are Arabic. There's similarities. There's some. It's a derivation of some older Arabic, but it's not Arabic. And so, learning the Qur'an and reading the Qur'an and understanding it is not simply a matter of growing up in a certain environment and then it's easy to understand. There's a kind of deliberate education that has to happen in a particular language and a particular style for someone to be able to access the Qur'an. And so there's a challenge even on the side of just understanding the Arabic of the Qur'an, even for native Arabic speakers and even for scholars. It's a struggle to learn the language and then struggle with the text to be able to understand it. That's before you even get to the level of translation. And then in translation, there are so many other problems. The problems of deciding whether you want to communicate ideas accurately or realize that there are other aspects of the Qur'an that also have to be communicated. Like the Qur'an wasn't simply about communicating truth. It was also in communicating that truth in a particular way, through a particular vessel. The recitation I played for you at the beginning was partly to try to illustrate that the beauty of how Minshawi recites that has a particular effect on us that wouldn't be there if it had been recited in a worse way or a different way. I want to share with you a translation by a professor from Cornell University, Shaykh Turawa. If you are writing his name, writing notes, write his name down and search him on YouTube. There's a lecture he gave recently. It's really, really interesting. And I'm going to share a translation that he's done of Surah Al-Rahman with you. And his idea is, he's a kind of someone who deals with literature. And that's his primary interest. And so he wanted to come up with a translation of the Qur'an that reflected the aesthetics and the sounds of the Qur'an. And he said that this has as much importance, or at least it should be considered alongside meaning. So I'm not primarily concerned, he says, with accurately conveying every single word of the Qur'an, but I want to, in my translation, I want to give focus on the aesthetics of the Qur'an. So just listen to some of these phrases from Surah Al-Rahman. Both of them pearls and corals contain. Which then of your Lord's wonders do you both deny in vain? The mountain-like ships in the sea are his domain. Which then of your Lord's wonders do you both deny in vain? Everything on earth shall wane, but not the countenance of your Lord, full of majesty, magnanimous, which alone shall remain. Which then of your Lord's wonders do you both deny in vain? Right, so he tries to maintain rhyme. He looks at the kinds of sounds that are mentioned, are used in the Qur'an, and tries to preserve those sounds and those aesthetics. And it's a very beautiful way of translating it. He himself admits that this isn't the best translation. It's not the perfect translation. I've compromised on meaning in certain things, in certain aspects, in order to fit the rhyme. right? But this is also beautiful. He says, don't delude yourself into thinking that if you have an accurate translation, you're completely communicating the Qur'an. You're focusing on meaning, but you're sacrificing the beauty. I'm focusing on beauty and I'm sacrificing meaning. There's no perfect way to do it, but I'm trying to shift the balance to this side, and I think this is also valuable. So that YouTube video, Shawkat Turawa, T-O-O-R-A-W-A, it was a very exciting lecture for me, and it was a beautiful thing. So this is a tool that we have, and kind of a new kind of a trend that we have. People are coming up with different ways of translating the Qur'an, which will inshallah help us to access it better. One other reference I came across, there's this an artist named Sandow Burke, a convert from California. He's written what he calls the American Qur'an. And so he's handwritten the entire translation of the Qur'an and illuminated it in ways that are with scenes from contemporary American life that reflect the verses of on that particular page. Right, so a particular, he'll write some surahs, and then on that page he'll find certain images that match up. Surah Al-Adiyat, he has NASCAR racing, which sounds weird and sounds really absurd, but just look at it. It's an interesting way. The translation itself reads very beautifully, and then there's a kind of a visual side to it. It's all hand done. Hasn't been published yet. It's still in museums. All right. So there are challenges to understanding the Qur'an. We've talked about two of these. One is the sequence and the order of the Qur'an, and then the problem of translation, which will never be solved fully, but hopefully as people develop different ways and better ways of communicating the Qur'an, we'll be able to access it more and more. One thing I want to leave you with in the last couple of minutes that I have is with hopefully some motivation and an exhortation to consciously and actively reflect on the Qur'an. I think one of the things that's happened in our Shi'i community, because we have scholars and we have a very strong scholarly legacy, we have, I think, it's almost created a crutch for the layperson, right? Where in many instances, because you have access to a scholar, you feel like, oh, I don't really have to do the work. I don't have to learn necessarily. I don't have to justify my beliefs, because if I'm in doubt, I just ask him and he'll tell me. If I have a question on something, a minute detail about something, I can just ask him. I don't need to bother learning the whole system or learning a bunch of things. When I have a question, I'll just ask and I'll get the answer. One of the things that's done is it's kind of hampered our courage and our ability to approach these texts, approach the Qur'an, and have the strength to explore and to think and to entertain different kinds of meaning that they could have. Primarily, I think, because we have this idea that, well, there's a truth. The Qur'an's telling us something that's real, that's true. And if I just kind of fumble my way through it and try to read it myself, maybe I'll come up with the wrong answer. So it's better not to do that. Let me just wait until someone else tells me what the Qur'an means, and then I'll just take it from him and take it from her, and then that'll be it. I don't have to really do the work myself and reflect on it myself. Just wait for the right answer. I want to encourage you not to do that. It is true that there is a truth, that there's a meaning. There's one right interpretation of a particular verse, for instance. I think that's a clear thing. But that's not necessarily what we're held. That's not the standard that we're held to, and that's not the standard that we should hold ourselves to. In many areas of Islamic thought and practice, we're not held to reality. We're held to what was justifiable. Let me give you, I don't have much time to go through all the examples I wanted to go through, but let me give you an example of, for instance, tahara and najasa. Right? If you are, the legal ruling, if you have some food in front of you, and to the best of your knowledge, it's halal food. You followed the rules, and you have this meat sandwich, like a cold cut sandwich, and you believe that it's halal. In reality, it might be pork, it might be non-dhabiha. But you've done your due diligence and you think it's halal and you eat it. Islamically, you have done nothing wrong. You have not committed a sin. You're justified in eating that, even though in reality you've eaten something that's haram and najas. You will not be punished for that. You've committed no sin. There's absolutely no effect of doing that real haram act because it's not actually haram for you. Allah doesn't hold us to the standard of reality. He doesn't say, well, you should have known better, or you should have been able to see that this was pork somehow. He doesn't hold us to that standard. It's an unreasonable standard. He has no right to hold us to that standard. Our intellect tells us, there's my alarm. Our intellect tells us that he would be unjustified in holding us to that standard. So my point is that even though the Qur'an is telling us something, there is some reality behind it, we are totally justified in exploring, thinking, coming away with some meaning and saying, it seems like this verse is saying such and such. What's wrong with that? Does that not border on tafsir bil-ra'i, kind of using your own, kind of impressing your own opinion on the Qur'an, and will you not end up with wrong ideas? Possibly. The only pitfall I can see is if we become too committed to our conclusions. If we do that, if I read a translation especially, which has so many layers of distance from the original, and if I read that and I say, based on this verse, I believe such and such, and this is true and everything else is false. Right? That's silly, pretentious, unfounded. That's when it becomes wrong and arrogant. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with reading it, understanding something, saying, it seems like this is what the Qur'an is saying. And having that as like a provisional, sort of a temporary conclusion until it's disproven. And then you engage with somebody, you either do further research yourself, you express that to someone else and say, this is what I think the verse is saying, what do you think? And then they say something else, and you're like, I see where I made a mistake. You take that to a scholar, you engage with a scholar with a book of tafsir, and you see that your original understanding was incorrect, and now you adjust it, you addend it, and it becomes stronger and better. But through that process now you've engaged, you've made an effort to understand. You're no longer simply doing taqleed of beliefs and ideas, and simply saying, well, he said it's written here, therefore it must be right. But now you've engaged and you've become a kind of a partner in that process of deepening your understanding and your learning. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't be scared of that, and we shouldn't think that that's somehow, revolutionary and it's kind of, undermining a system, or somehow we're going to be led astray. As long as we are humble and we understand that our kind of imperfect conclusions that we draw from our reading are provisional, subject to all sorts of error, most likely wrong, but still clearly what I understand from the text at this point, and based on what I know so far. That's a wonderful first step to then eventually engaging and then deepening your understanding and going deeper and deeper into the Qur'an, to which there is absolutely no limit. Right? There is no limit that you're going to eventually get to, and you can say, okay, now I have the entire Qur'an, I understand everything. We're never going to get there. So we can engage, we can take that first step, and then at least we're on the path. One last thought that's kind of in line with this. We have this idea, we're constantly asking Allah to guide us to as-sirat al-mustaqim, right? It's really key that we understand that the sirat that we're asking Him to guide us to is a sirat, it's a path. It's not a destination. We're not asking Him to guide us to a destination. Take me to some destination, some level of knowledge and understanding where I'm done. I no longer have to do anything else. Now somehow I'm guided, I can just kind of freeze, and that's it. We're asking Him to guide us onto a path, which by nature of being a path takes us somewhere. Right? We just wanted to keep us on that path, so as we progress, we're going in the right direction. We're not going in other kinds of ways that are taking us away from Him. So in the Qur'an also it's the same idea. Guide us to a path, guide us to the Qur'an in such a way where we can engage with it, understand it, take these steps, and then work towards this infinite down this infinite path that's getting us closer and closer to Him, which has no end, but somehow we have to start and take that first step before we can even be on that path. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.